Andy. Okay, let me. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming in. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from whichever part of the world you're joining us from. Just to confirm if my audio is good to go.
Yes.
Okay. So on behalf of the online events committee at EAFE, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on really asking the critical questions of why African feminist macroeconomics. So I am Precious Trisha Abwoli, and I'll be your moderator for today's session, and I hope I will do you good. So just some few reminders and ground settings for the webinar is that today's event and webinar will be recorded and posted on EFA's YouTube channel, and just like all the other previous events and series. So in case you want to look through what other webinars have been held, the channel is available for that. But we also have other online events coming up, and they are in the works. So please just keep an eye out for more information regarding any of those. And for the house setting, is to say that just like every other Zoom meeting, is we decided not to make it a webinar of where we are just having speakers and not having a conversation with the rest of the the participants, but this is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar. So just a friendly reminder that we keep ourselves muted, and so that we don't interrupt the speakers, but also don't interrupt the session. And we also invite you to post any questions, any reflections, comments in the chat, but also any resources that you might have. I think it is our dream to also collect a reading list of African feminist macroeconomics after this. So it would be lovely to just hear from you what you've been doing in that area, and just post them in the chat and we shall collect them and share. So please let us know if you have any other questions, and we will make ourselves available to answer almost each and every one if time allows. So with that, allow me to formally welcome you to today's webinar. Of course, we find ourselves at a critical moment where our economies, our survival, our bodies, our justice is becoming the questions around all that is becoming very much louder and sharper. And it's not just the continent, but really globally as well. And yet we find ourselves in a space where economics on the continent especially has been constantly presented as a neutral, very technical, and something very detached from our lived realities. So of course we invite you to come and reflect with us, reimagine with us, but also challenge the same narrative that this is not neutral, that this is not a neutral space, and also acknowledging that defining it as such obscures power, but also it erases the labor, the knowledge, and experiences um, of not only our economies, but also of African women and all other structurally marginalized groups on the continent. So without further ado, please welcome to the session. And we have titled the session, Why African Feminist Economics, just to really look into the narratives of what we have been shaping collectively, individually, and, every one of you. So it is one of the many series to come, just as we gear up for EAFE 2026, and we hope to see many of you there. But also before we meet, I think the session will just invite us to unpack what African feminist macroeconomics truly means. So with that, I would like to take the pleasure to introduce our speakers, but I will introduce the first speaker to really come and take the floor in unpacking the myth of the neutral economy and explore the intersecting crises, shaping the continent, and reflect with us what African feminist political economy, whether it is actually relevant or it is necessary. So just really looking at those critical questions. So with that, allow me invite Fatima Keleha. Fatima is a feminist political economist. strategic and technical advisor, a researcher and activist with 25 years of experience in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. She is also part of the Nawi AfriFem Macroeconomic Collective, a Nigerian and Black British Pan-African feminist, and focuses much of her work on gender, economic justice issues, with specialization in trade, decent work, care, fiscal justice, and feminist economic realities and alternatives more widely. So Fatima is also a long-standing published has long-standing published experience in education and health sectors and has authored research and articles for feminist organizations, the UN and international agencies, think tanks, and media outlets. She currently serves on the board of the EFA, the editorial board of the Society for International Development, and the Gender and Trade Coalition Steering Group. She's also a creative writer and scribbler of the verse. So with that, Fatima, please take us through. Over to you.
Hi, thank you all. I actually think that Toko is the one who's going to be going first, according to the run of show for this, who'll be speaking on busting the myth of the neutral economy, and I'll be speaking on feminist political economy
Oh,
afterwards. Yeah.
sorry, I think then I'll just introduce both of you and then we'll have Toko come in. Sorry for
Right.
that. I'll introduce Toko, and Toko is a feminist political economic researcher and PhD candidate based at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, Wits University. Toko's work really interrogates the gendered dimensions of fiscal policy with over 20 years of experience in public finance, but also her work focuses on austerity, public spending, and microeconomic governance, shaping social reproduction and inequality. She also engages with civil society to advance feminist economic justice. And with that heavy CV, of course, we have no doubt that Toko will really dissect what the neutral economy stands for. Over to you, Toko. You are
Thank you
welcome.
so much. Sawubona, Molo, Dumela, Jambo, Akam, Sanu, Ndeo, Assalamu alaikum, Azul, Mbote, bonjour, hola. So a little bit of flavor from the continent to get us started. So welcome. I am a daughter of the continent. I was born in Zambia. I grew up in Zimbabwe, spent my holidays in Botswana, and was educated and fell in love in South Africa. So that's a little bit of my claim to the continent. So yeah, I'm going to talk very briefly about deconstructing the myth of the neutral economy and unpacking intersectionality of Africa's economic crisis. And I'm not going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation and going to try and keep it to time. But I just want to say from the outset that this presentation is heavily influenced by the work of Fadal Kaboub, who is an African economist and scholar and has influenced my thinking about how do we make sense of what is happening. And so when we think about African feminist scholarship and feminist political economy, essentially from the lens that I come to this, and many of the scholars that I've read, is that it is about making gender visible and making women's labor visible in particular. And so unpacking the dynamics of unpaid care work, subsistence farming, informal trading, community survival work, which is often overlooked. And we argue strongly as African feminist scholars and as African feminist political economists that mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, ignores the work that sustains society. So our role, why do we kind of single out the African in this session and enable us to think about the history and politics of where we live as African scholars, but also how we engage in the global conversations. And so it's really about linking gender to the history of colonialism, our colonial past, and global power. And so we look at issues issues of colonial dispossession and the continuation or the almost the reintroduction of colonial dispossession as we're seeing in the Middle East right now, structural adjustment programs, debt regimes, austerity policies, global trade systems. So we examine how neoliberal reforms, capitalism, how it affects the notion of development of the welfare state, how services are privatized or not. We are concerned with the increase in unpaid care burdens on women and those also marginalized. And in an intersectional, so not just add disability and stir, but we really want to think about what does it mean to live and work and engage in economic activity when you have multiple intersecting needs and experiences. So what did colonialism do to Africa's economy? And this is what mainstream economics often ignores, and that it's important for us to remember that colonialism was not designed for development. So it wasn't designed for developing our societies. It wasn't designed for producing democracy, peace, justice, human rights, gender equality, and so forth. Colonialism was deeply non-democratic, violent, abusive, extractive. And if you want to think through the lens around sort of the intersection between colonialism and capitalism, if you read the work of Nancy Fraser, the extraction and dispossession and exploitation is built into the system. And so colonialism and capitalism on its back imposed on Africa three key economic roles that I would argue us as feminist scholars and African feminist scholars need to think about today. And that is Africa as a source of cheap raw materials for the global north, as a consumer of global north industrial output and technologies, and as a place where the global north dumps obsolete technologies and assembly line manufacturing, not to mention waste, pollution, and so forth, that the north no longer needs, but under the guise of development, cooperation, job creation, partnership. And as Fadal argues, this is intentional economic entrapment. And so when we are trying to understand the role of informal traders I'm currently in Durban at the moment working on a project on the effects of heat for informal traders, we need to work back this chain of the system that they find themselves in, and how the design of the actual city itself from its colonial and apartheid roots. So what this means ultimately is that the continent, in terms of our inequality, poverty, the list goes on. We break all these records depending on where you live. We've got now increasing insecurity, and the impact of climate change. We see that we have structural economic deficiencies, high external debt, and the major root causes of this debt is our energy deficits. The fact that we now, the crisis in the Middle East is showing how dependent we are on importing energy, fuel, and even a country, Nigeria, which is an energy producer, is still at the mercy of the market and importing. And so we are able to produce the kinds of energy that is needed to drive sustainable economic development that is just and fair and respects the environment. We have food deficits, so a large proportion of the population, the continent's population, is food insecure. In South Africa, for example, 15 million people go to bed hungry, and 1 in 4 children in South Africa is stunted. This is supposedly one of the powerhouses on the continent, and we have children not being given enough food to be able to grow appropriately to their age. And this puts pressure, as we know, on the care burdens of families and households. And we have, and also in contribution to the food deficit is that we are encouraged through market pressure and having export-orientated economies. We then grow cash crops that we export but cannot really eat, or are not suitable for domestic use because we're using them as cash crops. This then makes the situation even worse, where we're growing the kinds of foods that are not sufficient enough for us to feed ourselves. And then we have what is termed low value added industrialization. So where we do have factories and businesses, they're highly dependent on importing technologies. Again, they're dependent on low value. They're not are based on high technology development like we have that the North has access to. And an important example of this is the manufacturing of medicines. For example, is that many countries on the continent have to import expensive medicines that are much needed for health services and delivery, and other, not only medicines but other health technologies, but we don't produce them ourselves. The other example around energy, again, which is interlinked, is the production of renewables. We don't have the technology, or where we do have, it's very low capacity because we're importing most of the components, and that creates, it becomes expensive and creates what we now see as major trade deficits. And this affects the currency of our countries. It fuels food and fuel price inflation. Again, I don't need to say many of our economies are under strain because of the crisis in the Middle East and the impact that is having on fuel and food production. And this then also leads to social unrest. And so what our countries try and do where they can, and if they're able to under IMF World Bank rules, they try and introduce subsidies to maintain food and fuel prices. But this then leads them to have to borrow more from foreign lenders or domestic lenders, which is only really a band-aid solution, because then it becomes this virtuous cycle. And then we have austerity, which we know disproportionately affects women, where we see budget cuts or the disproportionate move away from the provision of public services to the private provision of those services, which has implications for poor households. So the result is essentially, if you can see this map of Africa, within the globe, is that there is a net neocolonial wealth extraction of over 2 trillion from the global south to the global north every year, and Africa is a contributor to that. And so it is a completely skewed system. And then we see that, companies like ExxonMobil, they make $360 billion, Shell, $280 billion. It's just completely crazy. And then in talking about trying to address this through overseas development aid or through climate finance, they're talking, at the last COP, they spoke about 0.7 billion in loss and damage, and sort of 300 billion for climate finance pledges, when we have a 2 trillion outflow to the global north. And so the global north needs Africa, and Africa does need the global north, but we need to think about how we understand these relationships and the impact that it has on women, and the gendered nature of these structural situations. So what are some of the solutions that we should be thinking about and investigating to say that this is not a gender-neutral economy? So we need to think about a pan-African and pan-global South cooperation for strategic investments in food sovereignty, and note that I don't say security, sovereignty, because we want to talk about agroecology, we want to talk about nature-based systems, and we want something that's permanent. Whereas food security, investing in security often just leads to insecurity. So it doesn't result in a system that is sustainable. We want to talk about renewable energy sovereignty and not just renewable imports. And we want to talk about high value added industrial policies that are nature based, that are sustainable, and not just high tech, not just AI, or having these data centers that are water heavy. And so we need to think about how we can become more independent in the provisioning of what is needed for populations. So we want to see renewables infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, green transportation, and investment in the public sector and the public good. And we want structural transformation, so not reform. So we're not saying that this is something that can just be tweaked. We want to see a global financial architecture as well as international trade, investment, and taxation architecture that is cognizant of the role of unpaid and underpaid labor and the role that nature plays in economic activity. So Fadal Kabub calls this the geopolitical bargain of the century, and I would argue that we should support it, and that essentially Africa does have a plan for itself. Many of you on this platform, as scholars, as researchers, know that we could provide and produce a new multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity that is grounded in gender equity and not extraction, exploitation, dispossession, as we're seeing in many places. So to conclude, the time to act is now. So AFI bringing us together on these platforms, bringing many of you from, I know you're not just based on the continent, you're coming from all over. And this, capitalism and the polycrisis, however you want to name it, calls for urgent, bold, and radical action. And radical in the sense of enabling us as feminist scholars to be able to reclaim claim, depending on where you are, the importance of visibilizing what has been made invisible. And again, a Pan-Africanism and global South unity and global North solidarity in economic and geopolitical prerequisites for development. So partnerships around a just and equitable transition, industrialization, and critically gender equality. And then lastly, this better system is within reach. And it is possible, it is desirable, and it's affordable, and it's feminist. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Toko, for that. And I love that you've been exactly on time. So thank you for that. I was, jeering, but thank you for really painting the picture as to why the economy is really not neutral, but also really understanding why we are placing the African before feminist economics. So allow me introduce Fatima and hand over to you just to really give us what do we mean when we say African, the economic what the economic crisis truly means for Africa and the intersectionality of that, and really just critiquing the theory around extractive industries on the continent and their impact thereof. So over to you, Fatima.
Thank you so much. So I was asked to speak to the question of why African feminist political economy matters. And actually, I think, Toko, you have covered quite a lot of some of the area I was going to go into, which will probably help me keep the time. So that's useful. But what I'm going to do is see what areas I can possibly pull out a little bit more and other areas as well that I can delve into. But certainly that look at the extractivism issue. So first of all, let's just get our understanding of feminist political economics in place. Diagnostically, it is essentially critical to feminist economics more broadly. So as Toko mentioned, one of its greatest underpinnings is the question of social reproduction and care, emphasizing that hidden work, the intersectional analysis, very importantly, that critique of mainstream economics. So challenging the focus, the very singular focus, for example, on gross domestic product, arguing essentially, how myopic that is in terms of understanding what the consequences are of this economic system to both people and planet. A strong focus on labor markets and poverty, understanding how the feminization of poverty, as it is called, has occurred, gender wage gaps, the concentration of women in those inflexible, insecure jobs, and then, of course, conflict and peace, understanding how feminist political economy analyzes, for example, the ratio of allocated resources to security versus social welfare, and also highlighting how war related harms are gendered, but very critically, how economic policies influence reconstruction either positively or detrimentally. And, when we then bring the African feminist lens into this, it is very critical about going beyond that, sort of just adding women and stir. And it is very much based on not just going beyond the gender gap and looking at how power structures and issues of systemic injustices occur. Also, that critical aspect of the invisible foundation of social reproduction, but what Toko mentioned in terms of the colonial and realities, the neo-colonial realities that Africa still faces, and the global South more broadly, but obviously regionally, each of these has different manifestations and different characteristics. So that decolonial framework is absolutely essential. It rejects that Western-centric, economic model that treats Africa as a resource bucket, but it also recognizes and challenges that ongoing imperialist appropriation that Toko mentioned, which is inherent within the current geopolitical reality. And I think that's quite important for us to stress. It is inherent within the current geopolitical reality. So it is a corrective diagnostic to mainstream economics, recognizing interesting that economics is not a hard science, but a social construct itself rooted in power. That colonial link is critical. Feminist political economics more broadly also underpins that we have to go beyond the traditional unit of analysis that mainstream economics works with. So not just looking at the rational individual, but at the household and the community and society more broadly, recognizing that all individuals are embedded within those social relations. And within an African context or our multiplicity of contexts, this is absolutely critical. Why? Well, because to a large extent, we have yet to reach the high levels of atomization, individualism, singularity that many industrialized high-income countries have already reached. So an analytical approach has to be embedded within that more collective resonance of what is happening. And then, of course, that intersectional power. And this is not just about intersectional power as it plays out in terms of individual lived realities, once again, but understanding how these different intersections of race, class, ethnicity, geographical location, ability are ensuring that African resources keep flowing outward while labor is exploited effectively inward. And so within these core pillars, we have social reproduction, we have land and labor, and we have micro linkages. Again, with Toko, which Toko touched on, looking at austerity in particular, and what that means in terms of not just women's increased economic precarity, but other varied forms of gendered economic violence. And I'll unpack that a little bit more in a second. So let's first of all talk about social reproduction in a bit more depth. And this is really important from an African feminist political economy positioning, simply because, since the pandemic, we have seen a proliferation in the uptake of the care agenda in different ways across different organizations and entities. And there is often, from what I can see and what I have engaged with professionally as well, a reductionist take on this. It sort of, places or understands care as a very sort of simplistic approach to childcare, for example, or even more broadly, household care. Social reproduction recognizes that this is far broader. And I'll start off with the work of Lynn Osome, which is quite critical here in terms of really understanding what African feminist political economy definition of social reproduction is. So essentially, the comprehensive daily and generational labor that sustains capitalism and the patriarchy, heavily anchored in the exploitation of marginalized people, particularly women in the global south, and emphasizing essentially that it's not just care work, as we call it, but the essential, often unvalued labor, producing, nurturing, and maintaining life that makes all production possible. And really returning to the social reproduction foundation is going to become increasingly important because without it, we lose so much of what social reproduction is. And as a proliferation of sort of care agendas gets picked up, in programming and by different, actors, you essentially lose that holistic, overarching positioning that will lead to the correction, that will lead to the transformation that Toko also speaks to. Without it, we don't get the full understanding of what the actual subsidy is here that social reproduction is delivering, the way in which, women's work is being essentially costed to maintain the workforce, either for free or for nothing. And this takes, the financial burden of corporations as well as the state. It really helps us to understand what it means to go beyond the home when we think about care as well. So social reproduction and labor as a set of structured practices that the capitalist market not only devalues, but actually is dependent on for its own survival. And essentially, it's also the reason why that economic erasure takes place. And then when we talk about financial violence, so this is a critical aspect of where African feminist political economy is going. And we've got quite a few economists. So my own work, I think I should start off by just listing some of the people whose work sort of influences the work that I do, but also has helped to pull this presentation together. So I've already mentioned Lynn Osome, others like Georgie Sakata, Abena Odoro, Lebohang Leopoldo Peko, Crystal Simeone, Wangari Kinoti, Aurea Mozinho, Busi Sibeko, Ramasala Dieng, Sonia Falazzi. And I call these names because I think it is so important. It hasn't just been an invisibilization of African women's work. There's also within the economic sphere been an invisibilization of African feminist economists themselves. And these names sit both within the academy and within programmatic and activist spaces and sometimes move between the two. And that is a very important characteristic of African feminist political economy. It's about how we move from the street, so to speak, to the academy and then back to the street. And there I am borrowing from a fantastic presentation that was given as part of a keynote by Lynn Osome at an IFA a few years back. I think it was Geneva in 2022, and that is available. So please do have a look at that presentation. So that continuously sort of, moving and iterative praxis that plays a part in African feminist political economy. So I'll run very quickly through the spaces of violence within the economy. So, for example, the loss of wealth through illicit financial flows. Increasingly, African feminist political economy is engaging with that. Austerity, please do check out the work of Aurea Mozinho for this. Debt, Busi Sibako has done work on this. Tax injustices. These are all an intrinsic part of where this work is going, increase today in particular. And then we come to the issue of extractivism. And I was asked to speak on this more specifically. And again, Toko has sort of laid much of the groundwork for this. But, African feminist economists have already provided a devastating critique of the extractivist model, mining, oil, and gas. And again, I've mentioned names, but I think it's also important to note the many organizations on the continent whose work has contributed to the thinking around African feminist political economy. Organizations such as WOMIN, which is based in South Africa. I think the acronym stands for Women Against Mining and Extraction. Please check them out. They have done astounding work in this area, and it's active work as well. It is thought work, but it is also practice and extractive work in the spaces. So, looking at what extractivism actually means in terms of the impact. So the creation of masculinized spaces on the back of extractive projects, men hired for formal labor while women's traditional roles are disrupted, the displacement of food sovereignty. Again, Toko has picked up on this. This is absolutely critical. Very simply, when land is taken for mines, women lose that access to the commons, to the forests, to water that communities rely on for food, forcing them into precarious cash economies that essentially they cannot control. And it undermines not food sovereignty from a perspective only of consumption, but from a perspective of production. We no longer get to decide not just what we eat, but also, how we produce what we eat. So again, that push for an agro-industrialized paradigm as opposed to an agroecological paradigm. And that's a major battle line right now on the continent. And of course, the environmental violence, pollution, not just as an ecological issue, as a human one and as a gendered one, where water is poisoned, for example, women are going to have to walk much further to reach a clean water source. That's one of the most simplest examples we can give there. The role of trade liberalization here is also absolutely critical. The creation of that extractivist trap is, again, part and parcel of what feminist political economy is able to very clearly uncover. And, work is being done in this, not just in terms of trade liberalization with the rest of the world, but very critically in terms of our own integration process in projects such as the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And I think I'm probably near to time, but I'm nearly there. And this coming back again on this idea of sort of, the loss of commons, the way in which the commons itself is completely lost as a factor within mainstream economics is such an important part of this. It's again similar to the social reproductive aspect. This is an area that is completely invisibilized. What it essentially means is that women will not be, in a practical sense, will not be compensated for the loss of communal resources. The food insecurity aspect, and Toko is absolutely right. The language of food insecurity versus food sovereignty is really important to understand what the difference is there. When we speak about food insecurity, it's often an opportunity to, for example, push a green revolution agenda that will focus quite heavily or almost exclusively on cash crops and monocrops. And not only does this take away sort of your sovereignty over what you produce and what you then put in your mouth, it also completely undermines biodiversity, and we know this. And from a gendered perspective, this completely undermines the reality that women have within the agricultural space. It takes away their roles as seeds custodians, completely undermines them, and indeed criminalizes them to a large extent because of the way in which agro-industrialized products claim, territorial space over intellectual property of seeds once that process has been put in motion. And I think where extractivism is concerned, there is also a need to understand the uneconomic reality that it proposes. And here this is some interesting work that's been put forward by Melinda Janke, where she argues that extractive industries are often net losses for African nations when environmental cleanup and social costs are effectively factored in, so an ecological debt. And then I think the area that's most interesting now is debunking some of the understandings around what we're calling the green transition, and understanding it as potentially, or actually not even potentially, as in reality, a new frontier of extractivism. So the rush for minerals like lithium and cobalt are demonstrating that if the model does not fundamentally change, is not fundamentally transformed, as Toko has already argued, and if we just try to reform it, we are not going to get any different outcomes. This green economy, in inverted commas, will repeat the same patriarchal and colonial harms of the brown economy, the fossil fuel economy. So in terms of ways forward, Toko has already mentioned, a whole range of ways forward. I think the Pan-African positioning is absolutely critical, and African feminist political economy is often rooted in a Pan-African positioning. And I think the simplest way to understand what that is to recognizes in the first instance that Pan-Africanism is not just an economic project, which is something that I have written on as a critique of the current African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, it needs to be a political project. And the reason why is for all of these colonial, neo-colonial realities that we have already spoken about. A project like the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement will not take place within a continental vacuum. It will take place within a geopolitical construct. And if you don't have very clear Pan-African solidarity positionings, clear red lines, the question of whether or not that integration is going to lead to a genuinely sovereign Africa with genuinely sovereign countries within it, and whether our industrial policies, which I believe are soon going to be rapidly developed in the coming years, for a whole variety of reasons, not just the CFTA, but also many of the ruptions that we are seeing occurring on the continent, not just on the continent, sorry, globally, you are going to get a repeat of what has already occurred. But even if some kind of development indicators are ticked off as having been achieved on the back of that, you have to question what kind of just and equal societies you would have created. And I think it's good to end here with recognizing that industrialization and development, as we call it in itself, does not automatically deliver those just and equal societies, as we can see from the high income societies in the global north, which still have high rates of, relative poverty, as an example, people dying from lack of access to healthcare, and a variety of other iniquities that as Africans we definitely do not want to replicate just because, there are more bridges or the traffic lights work. And I will end with just a quick sort of, I suppose, snippet of why African feminist political economy matters. It matters because it provides the only map that acknowledges a fuller landscape of African life. It proves that a prosperous Africa cannot be built on the back of exploited women's labor, as well as a scarred earth. As African feminist scholars and activists are always reminding us, because they are on the front lines of these battles and at the coalface of the backlash of these battles, the economy must serve the people and the planet and not the other way around. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, this really I think thank you so much for just anchoring us in the actual reality behind the current economic world order. And of course, realizing that it is one order that has been driven by capitalism, patriarchy, but also an order that really states or dictates who gets to be recognized, who is owed and who owes, and whose development matters. But also really looking at the fact that in this order, African women, have only been placed in perpetual economic shocks, without any reward for recognition, or even a reward for payment thereof. But of course, we like you already stated, and you already started us off, is that we do realize that the current world economic order has also affected so many other aspects of our lives. And like you already introduced us, it's one of the big aspects, it's the climate crisis, but also looking at the loss of our own sovereignty over what we eat and what we decide to eat every day and night, that Toko had already started us off. So I do want to invite both of you just to take us through a discussion on what's the gendered impact of the current economic world order, like you stated, on the climate crisis and our agriculture system, our foods, our seeds, our water, but also in general, our livelihoods of economics. So I will invite you both. So I don't know, it will be a discussion between both of you, but also you could choose how to have it. So over to you.
I'll let Fatima catch her breath. So I think it's interesting and such beautiful comments in the chat. So thank you very much. Keep them coming, because we really wanted this session to be a kind of starting session so that we have a kind of map of where to go as the Africa IAFE chapter. So please, drop your ideas and thoughts in the chat. I think just from where I'm sitting at the moment, in terms of understanding, I think geopolitically we're in a very chaotic space. There is a lot of talk about the middle powers and the role of the middle powers now in terms of trying to make sense of, and that's middle powers can be defined Canada, Brazil, South Africa, somewhat, and other countries that are trying to begin to start a conversation that recognizes both the backlash or the silencing of the climate crisis by the United States in terms of its dominance, but other countries have also followed, those that have followed, and especially those with very strong right-wing movements. There is a demand for us to, we're almost being gaslit, to use that phrase, to as if that there isn't a crisis on the continent, and it's a triple whammy of both an economic crisis, a crisis of social reproduction, and that crisis of social reproduction is impacted by, again, the climate crisis and what nature is able to do under so much pressure to personify nature a little bit, but also the fact that we're witnessing in real time what has happened on the continent in other places like the Middle East. What we're witnessing is a colonial project. What we're hearing, in the same way that back in the 200 years or however 300 years ago, where they wanted to transport prisoners from the UK to Australia, now we have Trump wanting to transport their prisoners to Africa. So we are not far away from behaviors that we have witnessed in the past, and the challenge is to arrest it, to name it, and as Fatima was saying, is to also name each other and our work and how important our work is, both in the global south, but also those in solidarity in the global north that are trying to unpack the levels of this crisis that we're in and is coming. Many are saying this, what's happening at the Strait of Hormuz is actually going to hit next year because it's going to impact the crops being planted now. And so the food price pressure is likely to come next year, not this year. So it's kind of developing our thinking and our muscle to be able to interrogate this from a feminist lens, to show and to make visible what it means from a gendered lens, and what it means for vulnerable groups, or those rendered vulnerable rather than just labeling them vulnerable. So that's off the top of my head around, and of course the other warning as feminist scholars, and I hope as pacifists, is that the rise of the military-industrial complex has been almost emboldened in this current climate under the Trump administration, and so we're seeing huge, returns on investment in war, and with that, investments in the fossil fuel industry that needs to feed the war machine. And so we see now Namibia, even though South Africa has been, there's been activists and feminist activists, women and others fighting hard to prevent testing happening on our coastline. Namibia has said we're open for business, which has huge implications for both nature and for the Namibian indigenous populations. So it's those kinds of conversations that we need to have, and also the data and empirical research that needs to take place, using the lenses that Fatima has outlined.
Yeah, thanks, Toko. I, I think right now we are in unprecedented times, is something I'm sure we're all sick of hearing right now, but we are. And, you know, unprecedented in terms of the actual details of what's happening now, not unprecedented in terms of, the world is in chaos. That has happened many times before. But the way things are playing out now, particularly for the African continent, is very interesting. And I think this is actually a window of immense opportunity, but we need to have so many ducks lined up. And that is actually where the work still is. And possibly because we don't have that much time, I have to say, I was looking at some of the comments and questions in the chat, and there was one comment that jumped out at me. I can't find it now, so forgive me. I can't bring up the name. I will share the name in a second, regarding sort of, that we do understand how much of the current context has been created by the colonial past and the colonial reality. The question is, how do we move this forward? And I think you're absolutely right on the one hand, which is the evidence is there. We don't need any more evidence of how we got to where we are. And we need to come to a place now. And we have our propositions, we have our alternatives in place to the orthodoxy. What we need to be able to do is figure out how we engineer those realities, how we actually get to the work of making it happen. And I will come back to this issue of the policy of solidarity for the continent, because in all honesty, I cannot see us achieving any of these goals without that. As Toko started to mention, some of the spaces in which governments are going against what the activists and the campaigners are doing. We also have governments behaving in hugely varied ways. So everybody is familiar with, the health package that the US has been offering several of our countries. And we have, two Southern African countries that basically said absolutely not, because we know we're going to be surrendering all of our data. We'll have no sovereignty. And Nigeria, my country, said it's okay. Yes, you can have it. Right? So we have the complete divergence of sort of, positioning on something as critical and important as that. Every meeting I go into, there's this question of, what does the AU, what is the AU for? These are the places where some lines should be clear on what can and cannot happen, even taking into account the huge variances within our continent. And we know that our continent is the most diverse with, whatever metric you want to use, but even in terms of countries, we have the largest sort of inequality. We've got 3 countries that have more than half of the GDP of the entire continent. We've got 22, so-called LDCs within the continent out of how many in the world? Like 55. So we know that there are these huge variances, but that's even more reason why there needs to be a policy of solidarity around this thing. But back to that question. And I think we do know, and the evidence is there, but I think one of the things perhaps that we can't take for granted, shockingly, is how little actually that history is known in the spaces that matter. In a room like this, full of feminist scholars and those interested, we all know. And yet, when you go into the spaces where policy is decided, where huge decisions are made, I am continuously, well, I'm no longer shocked, actually, but I was initially at the start of my career really shocked at how little understanding there was of the continued coloniality of current policy paradigms that are followed as standard. And that's because neoliberal economics has taken an unbelievable stranglehold on the continent in multiple institutions, including our academies. There has been over the last 40 years a complete shift away from even an understanding that there was sort of, a pre-structural adjustment program era of independence and sort of industrial policies that were looking at import substitution and a whole variety of approaches that were essentially completely shut down over a 40-year period. And if you think about it, 40 years is an entire generation. I mean, that's a middle-aged person, right? So a 60-year-old now in a position of relative power within a ministry or, a think tank or whatever, would have entered university at the time this process started. They know almost nothing else. And economic history is not something that is taught very well, actually. It's not something that we refer to regularly. If you do so, you're often told that you're just being, too, frilly frally or whatever it is. But we need it. We need it more. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in bringing all of us onto the same page of how we got here and how what are taken as common sense normative approaches are actually deeply harmful. And actually being able to show how many of us are still trapped within that orthodox thinking. So I think we have to concentrate on getting that done. Otherwise, we will be continuously frustrated. At at the Naui Collective, we always say that the political is personal. And so I will just sort of end this last bit with a reference to an experience that I had. I started working properly in the agricultural space back home in northern Nigeria about 11, 12 years ago. And I was working for a pretty large international program. And my job was essentially to research and collect as much information from African women, from northern Nigerian women farmers as possible. And consistently, what came back to me, this project was essentially trying to find a way to push the green revolution and the agro-industrial paradigm. And what consistently came back to me from the women farmers was, we do not want hybrid seeds. We do not want fertilizer. We do not want this. We do not want that. Why? Because we have seen what it does. We have seen the way it traps us into the market. Hybrid seeds are not all that. Many of them are not in the food that we eat. We don't have the land that can produce this. We don't have the access to the water sources that we produce this. That's part of the land inequality that exists as well, with many women not being able to do dry season farming. And then, of course, you can't repeat it. That's the whole purpose of it. You can't repeat it, so you can't store it. You can't be a custodian of it. When I took all of that research back to the project, agronomists, my fellow countrymen, agronomists said their response was, it's because they are uneducated and they don't know good agricultural practice. And that is what we are dealing with at the practical level every single day. So we have a lot of work in that area that needs to still occur.
Yes.
Stop
Thank you.
because I know we have so many people who probably want to ask questions.
And I think we'll dwell into that immediately. And I do like how both you and Toko have really just looked at how the current engineered economic crisis has forced and the forced austerity measures that we have been, continuously forced to implement are financing our own oppression. So, of course, acknowledging that we must demand our own sovereignty, otherwise our voices just continuously be structurally marginalized. So with this, I will read some of I think like two comments from the chat, but also Wendy had mentioned that we will find ways of addressing most of the comments, but also to hear from everyone on the call. What are some of those aspects that you would want us, because we do have a few series running, and this is just really the first introductory series. So just to hear from you, what are some of those economic disparities that you'd want us to, build on in the coming few days ahead of Yafe, but also what are those things that you would want clarity on. So we can have two people unmute to just let us know what burning questions they would want the speakers to answer, and then can read one or two questions from the chat. So I think I can begin with Hadija Bonaya's question, and they state that it is clear that colonial extraction shaped so much of our current economic reality. How can African economics help us not to just talk about what happened, but actually break away from those old systems and build something new? I'm not seeing any hands from my side, but in case there are any hands, please do let me know. Or you could post your question in the chat and we can have a conversation before we conclude. I think apart from Hadija's question, I'm not seeing another. I think there's one here from Paddy, that the panelist position on the current economic growth approaches are not fit for purpose. The African platform has been working on influencing policy thinking on development cooperation that steers away from value-based system which positions the agency and voices of women and really matters to us. Thank you. I think that's a reflection. So I'm not seeing any more questions. Maybe Fatima and Topo could respond to that one.
Bonge has their hand up.
Oh, Bonge, over to you.
Thank you so much, Togo and Fatima, for amazing presentations. I think on the next coming sessions, I would really like for us to delve a little bit deeper on the difference between gender responsive budgeting and decolonial feminist approaches to public finance or political economy. Thank you.
Isaac, you can unmute.
Hi, thank you for the fascinating discussion. One theme that was raised, which I think I would really appreciate future discussions about, was the question of the so-called informal economy and how to understand it. It needs to be placed in a larger political economy context, and maybe also, if it's possible, to explore, its relationship with the social reproduction question that was raised. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think, Toko, you could go first in answering any of those and just reflecting on the few comments in the chat, and then we'll have Fatima close us off for a few minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for staying on and for the lovely comments. I really have to say that this is, I hope, the beginning of a space for us to come together, both as African scholars and feminist African scholars and feminist economists, and also to bring a space of solidarity, because I think one of the things that we need is to create these circles that of ways of being and doing that can influence the policy spaces that we're in, influence the activist spaces that we're in, and influence our academic spaces. I mean, someone is talking about epistemicide, so the real consequences of the silencing that is happening and the backlash. So, in preparing for this, I learned a lot myself and more, and grappling with that question of, so what is to be done? And I think the answer to what is to be done is always a collective answer, and requires, as many feminists in my circles would like to say, furious dancing.
Fatima.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. How long do we have, by the way, Trisha? I can't remember when we're supposed to be finishing. Is it on the
We were
hour? Are we
already
over?
on the hour, but yeah, off the hour a little, but
Oh,
just
okay. Okay.
We have
So,
about, Fatima, we have about 10 minutes.
okay, we have about 10 minutes. All right. So, forgive me, I was typing as the question was repeated, and there were so many questions in the chat. Could you repeat that for me, Trisha, the question that you wanted addressed?
Sorry, let me find it. It says it is clear that colonial extraction shaped so much of our current economic reality. How can African economics help us to talk about what happened, but actually break away from those old systems and build new ones?
Okay, I think that was the one that I was addressing actually in my last comment. So that's the one. And I think, yeah, it's absolutely right. So I think the point to make here is that we have a lot of work on African feminist alternative proposition. So feminist economic alternatives more broadly, and there are whole compendiums actually written on this by a variety of different organizations, and they are drawn from the global South more broadly, but with many African examples within that. So we have a body of work that we can start to move with. And it's a very pluralist body of work, actually. So, African feminist economic alternatives are like an umbrella term that capture, a whole variety of models, approaches, positionings, from the well-being economy to solidarity economy frameworks, to, the way in which different campaigns have challenged extractivism, for example, to, commitments on universal basic services, and a whole variety of bodies and case studies actually within that as well, drawn from across the global south on how you protect the commons, on how you actually put forward a very sort of rigorous universal basic healthcare system, how you fund it. And we've got some wonderful examples. I mean, for those of us who are going to be in Cali, I have to leave quite quickly, and one of my greatest regrets is that I can't go to spend any time in Bogota, which has got the Bogota care system, which is, a very interesting, powerful model on how care is being addressed from what many consider to be a very feminist positioning. So the examples are there and they can be drawn on. What we need, I think, more than anything from an African feminist positioning is to have that engineering really starting to take place now on what these alternatives not only could look like, but how we bring them about. And that's going to be a huge reality check given what we're dealing with in terms of the current policy space and the policy frameworks that we have to deal with. Let's be completely honest. We are on the margins of what's considered acceptable economic sort of, policy advice. Sometimes we are let into rooms, right, to have these conversations. And sometimes we are even allowed to speak, for more than 10 minutes. But will our positions be picked up? I've had policymakers say to me, everything you say makes absolute sense. But if I was to take this into my ministry, I would lose my job. That's also the reality. So we have to figure out ways how we deal with that. It's not that there's nobody within those spaces who is interested. They're actually potentially allies, right? They may not be accomplices yet, but there are maybe some allies in there that we could work with. What is it that we need to do to be able to utilize potential allies within those spaces in order to make this work? I think the academy is one of the first places we need to start because, as we speak right now, another generation of orthodox economists is being produced from many of our universities. They'll be graduating, this summer, and then they're going to go into think tanks and ministries and all sorts of things. So we need to start there. But there are also other spaces that we can start. And I think we need to have a concerted effort. And I completely agree with Toko. It needs to be a collective effort, because as I keep on saying, we need a policy of solidarity on multiple levels, including on how African feminist economists and the African feminist economic collective, whether you're in the academy or in other spaces, how we move forward together on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I really do like how you emphasize that African feminists have been coming up with alternatives. It's just that what you get to see and who defines your narrative has also been assassinated from us for the longest time. We have I have jotted down everything that people wanted us to expand on in the coming webinars or online sessions. And I do hope that we do address some of these, including the gender responsive budgeting comment, as well financialization. And just to say that a lot of these have been grossly written around by African feminists, and we will share a collective of a reading list just to guide some of these, to answer some of these questions ahead of the webinars that we'll have in the coming days. And months way before EFA, way before we meet in Cali. So that reading list, I think Wendy and the EFA staff will share part of what that looks like. But you can also share with us any resources, any think tanks that you have come across or read, for us to add into that collective pool. But also, it's just to re-mention that this recording is also now part of a resource, and it will be posted on the EFA YouTube channel. So just look out for it, and once we are done in the coming days, it will be available. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tokozile and Fatima. And thank you everyone for really listening and joining and being with us throughout this minute. I know economics can get very, very, very overwhelming. So thank you so much for the helpful and thought-provoking session. And just to emphasize that, please keep an eye out for the upcoming online sessions with EFA and the several planned activities and sessions during April and May, just to really build the momentum towards EFA, the EFA conference in Cali in July, but also to remind everyone to register for the conference because it is now open, and the remote conference will also be held in June from 26th to 27th, and the in-person will be in July from the 9th to 11th. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to having you all in the future sessions. Over to you, Wendy. Bye.